Greetings, everyone. This is Abdullah Alasmari. I'm a master's student in the Linguistics and Applied Linguistics program at ASU. The title of my presentation is Periphrastic Passive Grammaticalization in Modern Standard Arabic. So, in this presentation, I will examine a new passive form in Arabic from a language change perspective. I argue in this presentation that tem has actually grammaticalized to an auxiliary, and I provide two evidence to support this claim. The first evidence comes from the shift of tem complement from noun in classical Arabic to a masdar in modern standard Arabic. The second evidence comes from the loss of gender inflection on the auxiliary. I'll also show that modern standard Arabic allows completive aspect to perform passive function. But before I talk about passive constructions in Arabic, I'll give a quick background about classical Arabic and modern standard Arabic. Classical Arabic dates back to the 6th century, where we have a lot of literature that dates back to this period. The rise of Islam reinforces the status of classical Arabic since it's used as the language of the Holy Quran and continued to be used as the language of writing until 18th century. Oral varieties of Arabic coexisted with classical Arabic. However, none of them were used as a writing language. At the end of 18th century, new literary forms and vocabulary were introduced to classical Arabic. This could be attributed to the establishment of generalism and the spread of universal education. Modern Standard Arabic has started to be used as the language of all modern text, from books, journals, newspapers, and even street signs. This gave rise to new linguistic constructions, such as the one that we are interested in this presentation. When we survey the literature about passive constructions, we see that most of the studies have adopted transformational account of passive constructions. This transformational analysis is based on Chomsky 1981, Roberts 1985, and others. It views passivization as a process that suppresses agent and accusative case assignment due to passive morphology. Chomsky in 1981 admits that this treatment of passive does not capture the heterogeneity of passive construction in the world languages. Shabatani in 1985 recognizes such a challenge and attribute this to the restricted analysis that was based on only syntactic transformation of passives and passive-like expressions. He proposes a new treatment of passives and passive-like constructions. He offers a broad analysis for the passive phenomenon, which is based on what he calls prototypical passive properties. These properties serve as a background on which we can measure passiveness of other constructions. The following four properties are proposed by Shepatani, 1985, for prototypical passive. So the ideal passive must contain all these properties. So when a construction satisfies all these properties, it's considered an ideal passive. However, the less properties are present in a construction, the lower it is on the scale of passiveness. So for the first property, for example, the agent must occupy a lower position on the hierarchy in order to be considered defocused. So for the semantic property, the emphasis is on the subject affectedness, and the syntactic property, the agent is ideally deleted, the theme is promoted to the subject position, and we see the valence reduction, which is a normal result of the passivization process. Also, when a language has a special passive morphology, the higher in the passiveness scale that construction is. When we apply this treatment of passive cross-linguistically, it provides an explanation as to why, for example, reflexives are treated as passives in some languages. Modern Standard Arabic uses two constructions to express passive. One is internal passive, which is the older construction, and the other is the periphrastic passive, which I will be talking about in a while. So I'll talk about internal passive in Modern Standard Arabic a bit, and then I'll compare it to the prototypical properties as suggested by Shepatani, 1985. Internal passive employs a very special process called melodic overriding to mark passiveness on the verbs. So this process is actually a substitutional process whereby the vocalic active pattern of the verb is substituted by the passive vocalic pattern. So as we see in this table, the perfective active vocalic pattern of this verb undergoes this process and it became kutiba. So it used to be kataba and then it's kutiba, and this is the passive morphology. Also in the perfective vocalic pattern, we'll see the active form here of the verb yaktub, and it becomes yuktab. So in addition to the passive morphology, at the sentence level, we can notice the other properties for passive are visible. This is an active sentence. We have the agent and the theme in here. When the sentence undergoes the passivization process, it becomes kutibati risalatu, and we see that the agent is deleted. Theme in here takes the nominative case, which is the case of the agent. This shows that this passive is ideal passive, and when we put it on the scale of passiveness, it would really score pretty high. Now let's turn to the periphrastic passive. According to Gully, the periphrastic passive can be found as far back as the beginning of the 20th century. Many examples of this construction can be found in the Palestinian newspaper Al-Karmal. Abdul Fattah 1990 compares the instances of both the internal passive and the periphrastic passive in Al-Ahram newspaper samples of 1939 and 1989. He found that 94% of passive constructions in 1939 were of the internal passive, while in 1989, 53% of passive constructions are of the periphrastic passive. This form of passive consists of the auxiliary tem plus a masdar, which is equivalent to Gramsci 1990 complex event nominals. Tem in its original sense is an accusative verb that conveys the meaning of completion, finishing, or achievement. While the verb can carry or can undergo different conjugations, only the unaccusative form of the verb is used in the periphrastic passive. Tem is also inflected for gender to agree with its complement. In order to understand what I mean by masdar, I'll present properties that masdars have in common with verbs. Cremer's 2003 provides the following example to argue that masdars are actually similar to verbs. So in this sentence, intiqadu is the masdar. So as we can see, we cannot pluralize the masdar, and the sentence is ungrammatical when it's pluralized. Also, it allows the adverb here bishiddatin to modify it. Also, it maintains the underlying structure of its corresponding verb. It also assigns nominative case to its object, which is al-mashruha. So based on all these properties, Cremer's 2003 concluded that masdars are equivalent to gerunds in English. Grammaticalization is defined as a process whereby lexical items lose phonological weight and semantic specificity and gain grammatical functions. Given that the status of auxiliary is very controversial in the literature, I will adopt Harris and Ramat 1987 definition of auxiliary that defines auxiliaries as grammatical words which express tense, mode, and aspect. Harris and Ramat, in addition, specified three criteria to identify auxiliaries. First, it selects another non-finite verbal form as its complement. Second, it does not select a noun as its complement. And third, it behaves differently from full verbs. I will use these criteria to investigate how tem is used in both classical Arabic and modern standard Arabic. In order to do this, I used the King Saud University corpus of classical Arabic to investigate the occurrences of tem. I found that in all instances of tem, it collocates with a noun complement. However, the opposite is found in MSA, where tem collocates more with masdar. So this shift from a noun complement to a masdar complement is an indicator of a change from a verb to an auxiliary. The other evidence comes from loss of gender inflection, what we can see in this sentence. So tem in here does not agree with the masdar in gender. To investigate this on a bigger scale, I used 20 feminine masdars to see whether tem in the periphrastic passive always agrees with the masdar's gender. This bar chart shows 20 feminine masdars and their occurrences with temmet with agreement and temma without agreement. Now, as you can see in here, the moments with feminine agreement on the auxiliary and others without is pretty close. However, we can see some difference in, for example, this masdar idafa, adding with feminine marker. So this conclusively, I think, shows that the verb actually has auxiliarized. The question that arises here, how and why does tem perform this passive function? To answer this question, let's see the Finnish line of change in the world languages. According to Baibi et al. And Haine and Kotiva, Finnish serves as the main lexical source for completive aspects grammaticalization. So completive aspects are defined as doing something thoroughly and completely. So, and the semantic nuance that attached to it is that the action is more emphasis is placed on the affectedness of the object. I suggest that the auxiliary tem conveys a completive aspect, and because it shares some properties with the prototypical passive, it functions as a passive in Arabic. So we see one similarity is that it emphasizes the affectedness of the patient. We see that it shows also valency reduction effect because the tem actually is an accusative verb, so the agent is not present. The question here, are there other cross-linguistic examples where completive aspects are functioning as passive? In colloquial Icelandic, we see that objective impersonal passive comes from completive aspect. The particle finished, which is a participial adjective used as a completive marker, is used in this construction. Also, the subject position is occupied by an expletive marker, which is equivalent to it in English. Finished here shows unchangeable third neutral singular features. So it seems that in both modern standard Arabic and colloquial Icelandic, completive aspect can function as passive constructions. With this, I conclude that tem in the periphrastic passive has indeed auxiliarized. I provided two pieces of evidence to support this. I also conclude that the completive aspect may function as a passive construction when it shares some properties with the prototypical passive. With this, I come to the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me this opportunity. And also, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Van Gilderen, for her continuous support. Thank you.